And now to get us ready for the welcome reception, we come to one of the most popular sessions of the symposium, the lightning talks. Today you're going to hear about topics related to borders from a few different perspectives. Your speakers range from graduate students to CEOs and everything in between. The one thing they have in common is they are passionate about their topics, and these presentations are often among the best you will see over these next 2 days. This session was added a few years ago by our chairman, Chris Tucker, and for those of you who know Chris, being passionate about what you speak on is a special trademark of his. So there is no one better qualified to organize this group. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you, John. Can everybody hear me? Excellent. So John's already kind of said everything that needs to be said, but as my special message, we all here are a loving bunch. We have folks that are getting ready to walk the tightrope for us for our entertainment, very like Roman Colosseum-esque. So here's the rules, right? They come out, you give them a round of applause. When they head out, you give them a round of applause. When they fumble, which it will happen, you smile, let them recover, and then when they're done, give them a round of applause. So this is very easy, and hopefully you will enjoy. I will first announce our first speaker, and then you'll never see me again, but you may hear me. So I apologize for pretending to be the voice of God. That's what all the guys, the tech guys back here call it the voice of God. Very weird. So anyways, Dr. James Biles.
Thank you very much. The purported demise of the nation-state and geopolitical borders is associated with the unfettered movement of goods, people, information, and capital. The catalysts driving this new world order without borders are technology and policy. Borders are an artifact of the modern nation-state. They symbolize power, authority, and territorial control. Geopolitical stability depends on the ability to impose and maintain borders. Mapping borders and territory makes space legible and facilitates centralized control. However, borders don't necessarily reflect or respect natural boundaries, yet they determine who belongs. The weakening of the nation-state and spatial mismatch make it increasingly difficult to maintain political borders. As a consequence, governments have attempted to fortify and militarize vulnerable boundaries. The concepts of globalization and network governance can help us make sense of the potential implications of the diminishing role of the nation-state and the demise of borders. For some, like Bauman, globalization represents the absence of fixed meaning and centralized control, a rescaling of power which reinforces existing patterns of domination. The human consequences include uncertainty and perpetual change. Network perspectives highlight the devolution of centralized power to more equitable, inclusive, and non-hierarchical institutions, which empower new actors while simultaneously depoliticizing social and economic issues. In networks, power becomes more diffuse. In the context of globalization, it is ethereal and weightless. In both instances, power is embedded in relationships rather than territory. If territory is no longer the locus of power, is this the end of geography and the death of the nation-state? No, it isn't. Network relationships and globalizing processes are spatially contingent, and their effects do vary from place to place. In combination with technological innovation, the discourse of globalization and networks justifies neoliberal policies which transfer power from the state to multinational corporations and multilateral organizations. However, in response to the increasing power of multinationals and multilaterals, civil society has turned to new technologies and the ideals of globalization and network governance to contest neoliberalism. Given globalization and network governance, the diminishing ability of states to control geopolitical boundaries, and the emergence of new actors, what will borders look like in the future? In a world of diverse, footloose populations with fluid and malleable identities, borders are no longer fixed spaces of territorial control and national loyalties. Consider, for example, the integrated network of overseas Chinese enclaves. After decades of migration and increasing transnationalism, Latin America can't be defined simplistically as a distinct formal region running from the Rio Grande to Tierra del Fuego. Instead, Latin America must now include Latino America, a functionally integrated landscape of communities of all sizes throughout the United States. We must also reconsider the geography of conflict. The notion that the boundaries of clearly defined cultural regions would emerge as flashpoints for strife during the 21st century remains quite provocative. Reality, however, is more complex. While cultural differences often drive conflict, globalization and networks make possible improvised attacks and small-scale skirmishes which flicker from place to place like fireflies on a hot summer night. Civil society has also redefined the meaning of space and boundaries, as social movements resist locally and project resistance globally as a symbol for other oppressed groups. Occupy Wall Street is a recent example. The ideology of globalization and networks is part of a hegemonic neoliberal project to promote depoliticized, market-based governance, giving rise to a ubiquitous, high-tech panopticon of constant surveillance and control. In networks, privileged location and connectivity are forms of power, and globalization often promotes polarization. Order without borders won't remedy existing inequalities, and new unanticipated disparities are inevitable. Thank you.
And now for America's sweetheart, Dr. Alex de Sherbinin.
The voice of God. So my name is Alex de Sherman, and I'm Associate Director at Season at the Earth Institute at Columbia University. And for the last, I would say, 20 years, I've been looking at how climate change will essentially affect the envelope in which we live and live out our lives. And so as the envelope changes, migration may occur. The popular media narrative is that climate change will induce mass migration from the global south to the north, whether from Central America to North America or from Africa across the Mediterranean to Europe. Indeed, recent research by colleagues at Columbia University showed that the drought, an unprecedented drought in Syria led to and contributed to the conflict, which indeed then provoked mass migration to Europe. So there is some basis for this assertion. What do we know about migration, however? What we know is that factors in push areas or source areas lead to pushes and that there are pull factors in destination areas. And there are these things called intervening obstacles, which are basically things like borders, which inhibit migration. We know that migration occurs on a spectrum from refugee to more volunteer-type situations, and that internal migration is easily 3 times the level of internal migration at roughly 750 million people globally. Research also shows that environmental migration is a major, basically goes through other major factors that are proximate determinants of migration. In other words, political factors, demographic factors, economic and social factors. In light of this, we might ask the question, what is a climate change refugee? Similar, we know that in refugee contexts, most refugees are moving from south to south. So you see the hotspots of refugees in sub-Saharan Africa and in Western Asia, with only a few places in the global north harboring major numbers of refugees. In the future, the breakdown of livelihood-dependent ecosystems is likely to be a major driver of migration unless we can develop climate-resilient livelihoods. In the graph in the next slide, what we will see is that the frequency and intensity of adverse impacts on livelihoods may lead to intolerable risks in the upper right-hand quadrant. And the question of the hour is, at what point will these risks drive rural subsistence farmers to leave their livelihoods and move to cities? In work we did with UNU and CARE, we basically showed that there are potential serious drying effects in Mexico and Central America that could lead to a lot of migration internally and out of the region. In the Mekong Delta, 2-meter sea level rise would displace up to 14 million people and potentially cause the loss of 1.4 million hectares in the Rice Bowl of Asia. In the Nile Delta, which is in the next slide, what you see is 11 million people are in the 2-meter level sea level rise area and about 500,000 hectares. But this is a much more geographically conscribed area with fewer options for migration, given that most of Egypt is desertous. So the question is, can we actually model this, or do we need a crystal ball? We, with the help of the World Bank, developed a report called Groundswell, released in 2018, in which we use a population gravity model, and we use environmental factors such as changing crop yields and water availability to model future migration. We had 3 different scenarios: a pessimistic scenario combining high emissions and poor development options with 2 other different scenarios here, and countries were modeled individually with a focus on internal migration. Each scenario combined 4 different model runs of crop impacts and water impacts, along with GCMs and different emissions levels. And the red areas are areas where yields or water availability will decline significantly. The results suggest that in the future, for both Central America and Mexico and Eastern Africa, which were 2 areas where we did deep dives, highland areas will see significant in-migration in red, and lowland areas and densely settled highland areas will see significant out-migration. Here we see headline numbers suggesting that in these 3 different regions globally, 140 million people might move by 2050. And that the pessimistic scenario in all cases is the worst case scenario with much higher levels. So the UK Foresight report, which is a benchmark in this area, showed that environmental change will likely cause people to migrate due to needs for income, that migration out of rural areas into urban areas has already been induced by climate and environmental impacts. And in the future, a vast majority of environmental migration will be internal, with most of it being south-south, even though the small fraction of international migration could be sizable. Temperature and precipitation have effects in different areas that are different. And finally, transboundary migration is less likely than internal migration. Economic factors will predominate, but we will see more clear climate signals in some of these areas, and we're very ill-prepared to meet the challenge. Thank you very much.
And now the one and the only, Dr. Jack Eichenbaum.
Now, the first part of this talk could be called What Goes Around Comes Around, or What Happens to Original Sinners in This Planet. And the second part of this talk is the future of us all, and that's right here in New York. And I do tours, and I can show it to you. First part of the talk, original sin, the Mexican cession. The rest of the continental United States, they got along with the Indians, they made some treaties, or they bought it from other European countries. This was our first big imperialism. What happened? In 1940, New Mexico was the only heavily Latino state. Now in 2010, they've come back, and the Mexican secession that's where all the Mexicans are. Europe, the Crusades, imperialist Europe, sending all the armies to conquer the Holy Land. And what's happened? Oh, now they're coming back. The Muslims are coming back to Europe. And if you'll notice on this map, there are lots of little black lines and black circles. And that's where the Europeans have built fences and walls to keep the Muslims out. And this is now the Muslim population in various European countries. In some cases, it's over 50%, but it's rising, particularly in places like France, over 7%. Let's go back about 3,000 years into Bible times. Into Bible times, the Jews were up where it says Israel in Galilee, and also in Judah in the highlands. And their constant enemies were the Philistines, who were on the coast. Well, the Philistines are the same word root as the Palestinians. Now the Palestinians have reversed Israel. Israel's mostly on the Jews are mostly on the coast, and the Palestinians are mostly in Jordan and in the hills. Jerusalem is a walled city, and there's a wall, the Western Wall, just to the right of where you see Jewish Quarter, and that's where these guys are usually praying. And these are the Orthodox Jews who pray at their Western Wall. That's a very significant wall in Israel. But there's another wall in Israel that most of you don't know about, and that's the wall that Israel has built around Gaza, which is a Palestinian enclave within Israel, and Gaza is also one of the places that the Philistines lived. Palestinians, this is their one place that's still Philistine. And this wall gets graffiti. All walls fail, and I believe that's the same thing in Arabic on the right. I don't like that stuff. I'm here in the New World. I live in New York, which is a very different place. This is Queens, where I live, and in the very top of this map, there's a big green area, that's Flushing Meadow Park, and that's where the site of 2 World's Fairs, and then these are the community planning districts, 3 and 4 and 7 on either side are both sides the greatest immigration parts of Queens. 70 to 80% of those people are Queens. Roger Sanjak was an anthropologist at Queens College who wrote this book about these areas in the 90s. This is a World's Fair that took place in 1939. One of the exhibitors at that fair was the Palestinian Mandate, and Albert Einstein opened that exhibit. And the League of Nations was there too. This was the site of the UN after, from 1946 to 1952. Robert Moses wanted to put the UN here, but Rockefeller convinced him to go into Manhattan. But this building, which was the New York City building, was used as the UN, and that big circle in front of the building is now where the Unisphere was built for the Second World's Fair. And this is a gathering of about 100 people who belong to the Queens Tourism Council and represent about 70 different nationalities. This is the Second World's Fair. Just below the red area is the site of the Unisphere, and just below that is that same building where the UN met. Same time, this is just about the same time as the Second World's Fair. This was the largest middle-class housing development built at the same time. It was Lefrak City. Huge, 3, 5, I'll come back to this because this one's not going to change. Lefrak City was built by the Lefraks. It was the last large middle-class development in New York. There were 5 building complexes, each named for a different continent. The only continent that wasn't represented was Africa. And in the beginning, African Americans didn't live in Lefrak City. Then it flipped completely. It went from white to black, pretty much. And now everybody lives there. And now we got somebody else coming up.
Now for Ms. Michaela Gawrys.
The definitions for international order that we use today started to develop in 1648. The world has since grown to be more cooperative in nature through economic globalization. Now we must ponder the future of borders by looking at current trends. Nations are no longer willing to accept oppression and lack of representation from recognized states. So the idea of borders must be redefined by looking at the potential outcomes for undefined border development in nation states. The fight for the nation-state of Kosovo was provoked by the oppression of Kosovo Albanians in Serbia and led to the war in 1998 to 99, leaving behind displaced people, burned homes, and the opening for a new state system. Because of the opposition from Serbia, international intervention was necessary after the war. The UN, EU, and NATO helped Kosovo by providing counsel in the development of national and local government and encouraged the call for its independence. In 2007, Marti Ahtisaari called for the official independence of Kosovo and autonomous rights for Serb-majority municipalities It was his official opinion that this was the only road to peace, and in 2008, Kosovo gained independence. Serbia continues to push the non-recognition agenda among UN member states, claiming that Kosovo's unilateral decision to become independent is against international laws that protect the territorial sovereignty of states. Serbia also remains concerned about the Serbian populations residing in Kosovo and lays claim to the territory due to medieval Serbian history. Kosovo Albanians also claim this territory as being part of their Illyrian history. But Kosovo is considered the Serbian Holy Land. And here we see 4 monasteries marked as Serbian UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But Kosovo Albanians believe the issue is actually about Mitrovica, home to the Trepča mines, the largest lead, zinc, and silver ore mines in Europe. Here we see a traffic jam because only one lane is open at the Serbian border. Serbian guards refuse to use the joint crossing facilities built by the EU. Kosovar officers in Pristina and at the border would like to see a more open relationship with Serbia, because the exact opposite can be seen at the Albanian border. Here, there are Kosovar officers talking with Albanian ones. According to them, the open cooperation facilitates smooth operations and helps to maintain civil order. The international community tried to mediate relations with Serbia and establish Kosovo as a multi-ethnic state. But Serbian churches are guarded in Kosovo today because multi-ethnic tensions caused the 2004 attacks on Serbian Orthodox churches. Some interviewees mentioned the Kosovo is Serbia civil campaign and the support it gets from the Serbian government. When asked their opinions on Serbians, some Kosovo Albanians were quick to say hate, but many knew that their hatred was for the Serbian government, not Serbians. The first agreement was a document outlining the process to develop autonomous Serbian communities within Kosovo and was accepted by both sides. But after the agreement, worries surfaced that Serbia was only trying to benefit without recognizing Kosovo. So in 2018, Kosovo set a 100% tariff on Serbia until recognition. Products were also marked with flags to discourage consumers from buying Serbian products. But Serbia will only return to dialogue once the tariff is lifted. The US is on record saying that recognition will be imperative moving forward. And the EU says that the only way to start the process of joining is by normalizing relations. So negotiations will need to continue in the future. Following the legal example of the Serbian district of Vojvodina, Serbia would like the international community to realize the illegal formation of Kosovo and revoke independence. However, there are too many Western countries invested in the success of Kosovo for this to happen. The land swap could reopen dialogue, but may not satisfy tensions. It could be a possible route to peace and has already been discussed, but Kosovo is hesitant because it doesn't guarantee recognition, and Serbia would be gaining more because of the resources in the north. The future outcome of Kosovo gaining full recognition is likely. Though we still see tensions today, recognition would open possibilities for more transitional justice mechanisms, and there is possibility of Serbian recognition because of its interest in joining the EU. Using Kosovo as a template, future state development may involve certain steps, including international intervention, ethnic transitional justice mechanisms, and mutual recognition, all under the umbrella of international law applying to the unilateral development of states. The process of tearing down modern border structures has already begun. Kosovo is not the first and will not be the last nation to seek sovereignty. It is time to reevaluate border definitions in a way that helps establish peace in 2050.
Dr. Peter Herlihy.
Thank you and good afternoon. I'm going to speak on new borders and indigenous populations in Central America. I'm Peter Herlihy from the University of Kansas. This is a project that the University of Kansas and the American Geographical Society worked on in Central America for 5 years, and indigenous people are not well represented on maps, but will be prominent on the AGS 2050 map, populations are growing and they're regaining their territories. We put together population information, self-identified indigenous populations of each Central American country, and you can see there are various years of the census work, and so we have an average of about 2010. The bulk is in Guatemala, where 80% of the indigenous people in Central America and 20 different languages are found, but there's significant diversity all throughout Central America for a total of 20% of the population. We wanted to see how that had changed over the years, so we looked at the 1492 population, which was 5.6 million, and today we have over 8 million indigenous people in Central America. Remarkably, the indigenous population has doubled in the last 20 years. In 1990, there were about 4 million. In 2010, there were about 8 million, the percentage increasing about 6%. We constructed a map, and Central America is not a country, so we had to construct a municipality map from all the different countries, collect them and put them into a GIS system to do this analysis. And we started by looking at the population. There are 46 different language groups, 8.1 million people, and about 20% of the population, just a little bit under, is indigenous in Central America. Those populations are concentrated in 4 different regions: the Maya region, the Mosquitia region, the Talamanca region, and the Darien. And these areas are predominantly indigenous, speaking their own languages and with their own culture. The 7 countries have 1,216 municipalities. 20% of the municipalities are considered indigenous. That means they have 50% of their population or more that are self-identified as indigenous people. We wanted to get a sense of the area, and the municipalities that are indigenous cover 24% of Central America. There's a lot of the old going on, but there's new. There's still land dispossession from cattle fronts, narco-trafficking, but there's also revitalized indigeneity, where people are regaining their identity and their territories. Indigenous regions are characterized by 2 great divisions. A, by poverty, forest loss, environmental destruction, and narco-trafficking in Central America today. But B, also by significant biodiversity and natural resources. You can see the change from 2000 to 2017, and that the indigenous areas are threatened by that advancing colonization front and narco front. A quiet revolution has occurred in recent decades whereby indigenous federations are peacefully lobbying for their ownership and governance of their ancestral lands, and a territorial turn is happening where they are getting them, their governance rights and then legal rights to their lands. The judicial base for this is well-founded. It goes back to the 1800s with international treaties with Great Britain, but the ILO Convenio, the national constitutions and laws, and the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights all give a base. We found 18% of Central America is now covered by these legal territories where indigenous people have legal control, governance over their territories. There are 1,183 of these indigenous territorial jurisdictions that cover about 18% of Central America today. This is where most of the natural resources, this is where most of the forests still remain. The question is, will indigenous people be on the map of 2050? A question that still needs to be resolved. Thank you.
Mr. Carl Phillips.
Good evening. This presentation, I'll be treating you to a series of maps that depict the changing roles and spatial configuration of boundaries or borders in Europe over the past century, and then I'll be speculating about the next 3 decades. Here's the legend. I grouped the borders into 3 categories. The weak borders are analogous to state boundaries in the U.S. Firm borders, obviously are typical conventional borders between nations, and of course militarized or strong borders. We're starting with World War I as a backstory to get us to the Cold War. Obviously Europe was just a few countries that were basically empires, but here we get into the end of the war and a Treaty of Versailles, and we see that it's a real mess. There's a lot of newly independent countries or emerging countries and declining empires that are breaking up. On the eve of World War II, the boundaries are, in many cases, more militarized than they were before World War I, and you know, most of them are conventional. World War II, of course, was the greatest humanitarian disaster in history and reshaped the world, as well as especially, particularly Europe and the Middle East, into more of what we have today. As you can see, this is before the Berlin Wall went up. It was really, Berlin was an armed fortress. So in the aftermath of the war, there was an attempt to establish stability through new international organizations. And of course, there was the partition of Europe between East and West, between the Soviet Union and the US and its NATO allies. NATO was established in 1949 and the Warsaw Pact soon after. So in the early 50s, in an effort to prevent future conflicts between West European countries, the European Coal and Steel Community was established in order to prevent Germany and other countries from, you know, rearming and fighting over those resources. By the 70s, we see that things are, you know, polarizing in the Middle East. There are a lot of independent countries in Africa, and of course we had the crisis in northern Cyprus. All right, by the 80s, we see that relations are beginning to relax in Europe. Things are improving. Borders are starting to become weaker between countries, and we see the beginning of the European Union. All right, by the late 80s, of course, we have the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism, or the collapse of communism, collapse of the Soviet Union, a breakup of many countries, and the expansion of weaker, more permeable boundaries between Western European countries. But they're becoming firmer in the former Soviet Union. Of course, in the 21st century, we see that the Middle East is becoming more closely integrated with Europe. We see the crisis between Iraq and Iran, and now in the 90s, in the current decade, of course, the rise of the ISIS caliphate and the huge refugee crisis from North Africa and the Middle East into Europe. Now we are currently in a new crisis round with Soviet or Russian invasion of Crimea and the Donbass war in eastern Ukraine. We seem to be drifting back towards pre-World War II conditions, which is certainly unsettling. In the future, we could either have a status quo where things don't change very much, which is probably not likely. Things are constantly changing in the world. We could have a peaceful outcome for those who are optimists, and if peaceful efforts are successful, or we're going to have a violent scenario where I foresee a possible reestablishment of a Russian empire. I did map Ukraine, though, as separate. If it's successful in resisting Russian aggression, with Western European and American help if that actually transpires and is successful. So, thank you.
And now Mr. Dean Wise in his cowboy boots.
Hola from Laredo, Texas. So what's happening at the #1 U.S.-Mexico border crossing? I was there last month with a group of Department of Commerce folks and toured through it for 2 days. And I want to share with you how we move goods, the infrastructure challenges, and a little bit about the future. So Laredo and Nuevo Laredo, the border town across the river, has a storied past. It's on the Rio Grande, halfway between Monterey and San Antonio. And some of you may remember this famous movie, which then turned into a series, Streets of Laredo. It's a little different now. And if you look at all the crossings, you see that Southern California and El Paso, when you include people, trucks, rail cars, and so forth, dominate. Laredo's relatively small. But put that thought out of your mind. When we look at the trade, Laredo is #1. Almost half the trade on the border between U.S. and Mexico. The southbound represents about 1.2% of U.S. GDP, or exports. And it's been growing, 4x since NAFTA 25 years ago, and growing at 6 to 7%. It's actually similar in size to the U.S.-Canada trade, each about $600 billion, but it's much more imbalanced, and there's about an $80 billion deficit, heavily northbound, and Laredo represents about $50 billion of that. Zoom right into the cities. There's the cities. What do you see? Well, it's actually not north-south. The river here is east-west. The river here is going north-south, and Laredo's on the east. And what do you notice? Nuevo Laredo, very dense, more population. Total combined is 700,000 people. Grew 35%. Some cartographer had fun with this. This is Tamaulipas. The very tip is Laredo. And what animal do you see? Well, the trunk here is 235 miles, and the backbone of the elephant is the Gulf of Mexico. To get there by truck, you have to stop. And there's 15,000 parking spots north of the city. You stop, and then there are actually 4 separate moves by truck: long haul, 2 short hauls, and a long haul in Mexico. 5 bridges get us there. They're very specialized. Number 3 is pedestrians to go to the outlet mall. 4 is how you get there if you're on 35. We're going to talk just about 1, which is the biggest truck facility, and 2, which is the rail. So here's the biggest truck facility. What do you see? Very big complex, critical infrastructure. But look at the river. It's only 100 yards, and of course it's backed up going north. See that little inset? And on the other inset, big customs facility. I spent several hours there. What's happening? Well, critical infrastructure, but wait. This bridge is only open during the day. It closes from midnight to 7:30 because the truckers don't feel safe driving at night. So there's a capacity opportunity. There's only 4 fast lanes, big funneling, but it's 7,000 trucks a day, 2.5 million trucks a year, 70%. And in that facility, what do? They look for hitchhikers, human hitchhikers. They look for content. Is that Indonesian cotton or is it Mexican cotton? Is there any cocaine in that saddle? And then what about the bugs in that lucky lettuce guy who was not lucky? Here's the rail bridge, 1 owner, but look at the bottom chart. It's actually, maybe you can't see it, but it changes color. On the right is nice orange on the left, that's Mexico. That's because in Mexico you can paint a bridge over a waterway under their environmental laws. In the US you can't. This bridge handles about 30 trains a day. It's a single track. They change crews in the middle of the bridge. Process issue. That's changing. VACUS equipment, these are the inspection systems that do the screening. We screen 100% of the rail, only 13% of the truck. South of Laredo, Laredo, you get into something called the flea market. This was the last piece of non-double track rail south. And then finally last month they were able to move it back, and now we have 2 tracks. You see the second track there. Here's our friendly U.S. Customs Border Patrol and the Mexican equivalent SAT. These guys do not have hoods on here. I don't know why, but they're all in fear of what's going to happen in terms of security. These folks do a phenomenal job in the customs inspection of our goods, and it's a very involved. Security is a big issue south. It's probably a 36x murder rate Nuevo Laredo versus Laredo. The good guys are on the bottom, the bad guys are on the top. Sometimes you can't tell. That's the Hell Troop from the Cartel del Norte. And we have a mayor that's killed, many others killed. So changing subjects, what's next? This is the group that used to be called the village people. Now they're the rural people. They're making the sign USMCA. You can sing the song. But there's very little opposition, believe it or not, to let's get the USMCA passed. It was signed by all three countries a year ago. Only Mexico has ratified it, and of course Nancy Pelosi is going to get on it. But we need to pass this. There's an uncertainty in the trade. There will be an immediate 10% kick, people are predicting, in terms of the border activity. And by the way, I think you saw the process issues I just alluded to. We're ready at the border with logistics and transportation. So let's pass USMCA. Thank you.
And now, last but not least, the best dressed man in geography, Mr. Isaac Zawarski.
All right. So, very simple question, where the heck did I put my border? And to answer that question, I'm going to try and pull a thread that has not been terribly well represented through all 7 themes that are core to this Geo 2050 event. So, for those of you who know me, you're not going to be surprised that I kick off with this slide, because the reality is that the world is not flat. So that thread that I'm talking about comes down to the fact that these borders we draw, these borders that we talk about and analyze, exist in a 3-dimensional world that we live in. So, theme 1, the world map in 2050. What does the world map in 2050 look like? Well, I'm going to step out on a limb that won't be terribly surprising and say that it's not going to be flat. We've been doing that for a long time, and we've been doing it for some good reasons. But the answer is that not just in 2050, but today, the maps that we need in order to support what we're doing in the world cannot be flat. The world is too complex a place to represent in that way. So number 2, geospatial technology, right? So this is a place where I come from, or this is a field that I come from. Today in 2019, we have technology like we've never had before in the geospatial world. More collection, more data processing, more computational horsepower available to us. We made a lot of compromises in the past to flatten out maps because that was what we were capable of doing. Today, we can build high-resolution 3D data of the entire planet as the foundation on which we can work on. So theme 3, fences, walls, and how people move. This is a topic that many of you are probably tired of hearing about in our daily lives. And the reality is that we hear a lot of proposals about different types of ways to address these types of border problems and controlling borders. You get some proposals that are new versions of the same things we've been doing for millennia. And then you get some kind of more modern, cutting-edge technology-based solutions focused on how do we use intelligence and surveillance technologies to be able to digitally control these sorts of border regions. And I'm the technological thinker, so I kind of lean towards that second path as being where we're going to end up. And one of the key pieces and hard problems that still exist there is how do you integrate all that data that's going to be collected? And this is a problem across the broader geospatial community as well. So, theme 4, globalization and trade. This is one, and I appreciate Dean's presentation just now, but globalization and trade is one of those realities of the 21st century that is influencing borders in a lot of different ways. You can think of China's Belt and Road program. This is just one of the kind of high-profile initiatives from first world countries that is changing the way that people congregate, where they live, where they are around the world. The 3-dimensional nature of the planet influences how those paths are created, and they also present risk fabrics as well. So, a good example of that comes from the international organization and disorganization side of things. The other thing that is pervading all of our news feeds for the last 2 years, Brexit, right? This is a great example of a future that we're going to have to increasingly become comfortable with, where the international entanglements from an economic perspective challenge our concepts of borders. The backstop in Northern Ireland is a great example of that, right? So, one of the core components here, the natural world and the border. This is a way that we have delineated things, and it has been a simple way of delineating things for a long time, right? It's pretty easy to trace out a feature and represent it on a two-dimensional map that is hard for people to cross. Well, in today's world, we can actually model what these sorts of things look like, and we can better understand how the geographic features that we have traditionally used as borders influence the way that people are going to move and conflicts can present themselves in the future. And even in today, in 2019, when a country like Yemen can have a high-resolution 3D map of their border region, all of their border regions, there's no excuse for anybody else in the rest of the planet to do it. And it becomes increasingly important when you start thinking about the physical geography of the world being a tool in the border strategies of these sorts of nations. We heard earlier about the way that land reclamation is being used as part of that strategy. All right, finally, spaces beyond the state. This is one where I'm going to go conservative and highlight the fact that more and more in today's world, again, driven by economic realities, first world nations are starting to push the boundaries of places where borders have not been terribly well defined in the past. So the Arctic is a good example. You can think of more complex examples like, shall we say, the moon, which it turns out is also not flat, or you name it, asteroid or celestial body. These are things that we need to start thinking about, and the core to thinking about all of them is remembering that we do actually live in a three-dimensional world. All right.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all the speakers. And nobody could have summed up everything we've talked about today, I think, as well as Isaac just did, hitting on all 7 themes. Gives us something to think about as we go out and have drinks and talk and prepare ourselves for another really exciting day tomorrow. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll see you tomorrow.